So that's a bit of the complication. People would say, why put a starting place thousands of years before you're actually starting to use it or you're actually inventing it?
Well, because maybe they wanted to track their history.
It could be, although even the history that they would have had, if they had lineages, for example, from around the 1st century BC, they couldn't have extended all the way back to 3000 BC, which is supposedly the origin of this long count calendar.
Okay.
So there's this real problem with trying to determine what is the origin of the long count. For my money, and some of my colleagues as well, they were probably setting it for numerological reasons. They probably invented it around that time, somewhere in the first couple centuries BC, and they decided that they wanted to be living in this era that was governed by the number 7.
Why is 7 an important number?
Well, so there are a couple of numbers that turn out to be important numerologically.
The reason I ask is, for instance, like I just had this fabulous trip all through the Yucatan Peninsula, and I was in Chichén, and there's a ball court, and even in the plaza area outside of the Kukulkan Pyramid, across from the Venus platform, you clap your hands, and at least from the ball court, there's 7 echoes. So to me, 7 is some special number. Maybe I'd like to know if you even know why.
Right, and we don't have to go even to echoes or things. We find inscriptions where 7's recorded as having a numerologically powerful meaning.
7 days of the week.
Well, that's 7 visible planets, European kind of style. But what it looks like in Mesoamerica is that they had numbers associated with the cosmic realms. So they kind of divided the universe up into 3 realms. There's everything that's basically below the surface of the earth, then everything between the surface of the earth and the highest trees, the canopy of the trees, and then everything above that. So the upper world, the sky, the middle world, and then the underworld. We hear a lot about the Maya underworld. It's really, we should really think of it as a community of beings who live underneath the surface of the earth.
Is this mythological?
So it's hard to talk about mythology, religion, when we're talking about ancient indigenous people, because they had developed these things independently of what was going on in Egypt or in Europe or in China. So when scholars develop these ideas of what is religion, what is spirituality, they were using those as the template, and then they try and apply them over to what's going on in Mesoamerica, and it doesn't always fit very well. But yeah, you could say it's their cosmology or it's their worldview. This is how they saw the universe. And it did have spiritual or religious meanings to them, as well as everyday meanings. I mean, when somebody dies, you bury them under the ground. If you believe that there's something about them that stays animate, right, if you want to call it a soul or a spirit or something, then that thing would be underground after they die. And you could see then that those spirits are part of the community of everything else that lives under them. So there's bats down there, there's snakes, there's gophers, anything that lives under the surface is part of that community. And so you could say it's religious because there's dead people in there, but you could also say it's just a location.
What do you think is the most significant piece of information about this particular calendar?
About this document or about so this, well, I'm very biased. I've been spending a lot of time on just 6 pages of this manuscript, the ones that have to do with Venus. And I think that's because I've spent a lot of time on just one verb. I have a friend who's a linguist, and she says, you're starting to sound like a linguist, because I went to her office one day and I said, I have a problem with a verb. I guess that's a mark of being a linguist.
And the Mayans love Venus. The observatory in Chichén Itzá seemed to be focused on Venus, and in different sites they had temples to Venus, temples to Mars.
Mm-hmm. And so what I'm finding in my own research is that turns out to be a very post-classic phenomenon. They were very interested in Venus for less kind of deep reasons, I think, in the classic period. Most of it was driven by solar and lunar observable phenomena. Yes, Venus was important, but not to the extent that it kind of turbocharged in the post-classic. In the post-classic, you get the much more intimate contact with central Mexico. And then there's this phenomenon of Quetzalcoatl, who you may have heard of. right?
Now, is Quetzalcoatl, I can't say it right, he's the Aztec version, and the Maya version is Kukulkan?
Is Kukulkan, that's right. And you can see they're the same in terms of the names, how they're built. Quetzal is the name of the bird. It can also refer to the feather or precious. And then Coat is the serpent, so feathered serpent or Quetzal serpent. And then in Maya, it's Kuk for the Quetzal. That's the Yucatec word for Quetzal. And then Kan is serpent. So you have the same exact conflation of those two words to create the name in both places.
Do we know it's his origin?
So it's a fascinating story because we get most of it from the Aztecs. And they tell us that in a couple of different versions from a couple of different sources that he was originally a man who was a priest and a ruler at the city of Tula, or Tolan in some of the sources. And he was this very austere priest. He was very into meditation, and he wouldn't sacrifice humans. He would only sacrifice butterflies. So he was this kind of cleaned up version of a priest. And then there was this other guy who was his nemesis, Tezcatlipoca, who was a darker figure. And they were in this political battle. It turns out in some of these stories that Tezcatlipoca tricks Quetzalcoatl, tricks him into, he gets drunk and then he shames himself. And so Quetzalcoatl no longer feels like he can be the leader of this community, so he bans himself from the city, he exiles himself. And he travels to the east. And it says that he goes from place to place founding new cities until he finally makes it to the ocean. Then he gets on a bed of snakes, and it becomes a raft for him to sail out over the ocean. When he gets out far enough, it catches fire, and it transforms him into Venus as the morning star in the east.
Wow.
So this connection of Quetzalcoatl to Venus is very clear in our Aztec sources. What's fun here is that we find the same thing in the Maya sources. So they're saying there's this guy, Kukulkan, who comes from the west, and he shows up, and he's the reason that Chichén Itzá works. There's all kinds of political strife in the post-classic. Kukulkan comes, and he helps that out. Then he leaves, and then everything falls apart at Chichén Itzá, and they have to recreate a new city, a new alliance. They do that again through the inspiration of Kukulkan at the city of Mayapan. And that's really the last Maya stronghold in the Yucatan Peninsula before the arrival of the Spaniards.
Now, I didn't have a chance to go to Mayapan briefly. What is Mayapan?
It's a fantastic city. It seems to have been built on a previously uninhabited site, so they probably wanted neutral territory. And there are these different families. The Shu family, which seems to have come from Shu, X-I-U, is a Mayan name, probably comes from Uxmal. And then the Cocom family comes from Chichén Itzá. And they needed to come together because they were the most powerful families in the Yucatan Peninsula. They needed to come together and form an alliance so that there would be some kind of peace in this region. The way they did that was to build a new city at Mayapan, which is just outside of modern-day Mérida. And
sorry, where is that? Oh, that's by Mérida.
Mérida,
okay.
yeah. And so then they did it by almost replicating Chichén Itzá. So they took some of the architecture. You'll see like a mini version of the Temple of Kukulkan, what they call El Castillo. There's a mini version of that at Mayapan. There's a mini version of the observatory, or the Caracol. And what's really cool from some of the research that I've done is that they took the look of these buildings from Chichén Itzá, but they took the way that they aligned them to Venus from Uxmal, which had its own traditions for commemorating Venus periods.
Would this be the Sibi Chaltun site?
No, so Zibil Chaltun is doing something totally different, but they also made it into the post-classic period. So they would have been an important city leading up to that time point. The two major families, though, don't seem to be coming from that site.
Now, the language, Maya doesn't really sound Spanish. I mean, do you think it's a derivative of Mandarin Chinese, or do we know?
There don't seem to be any connections there. But what's fascinating is that there are still around 40 languages that are all Mayan languages still being spoken. So you can have something like Quechua, Quiché, Mam, all the way down in Guatemala that are Mayan languages. They're different from Tzotzil or from Yucatec, Yucatec, which is up in the north and is often called just Maya. All of these different languages throughout that region, all Mayan languages, but all very different from any of the other languages of Mesoamerica.
So who are the Mayans?
I think it's impossible to say. It's just as ambiguous as saying who's an American, right? I mean, you could find somebody who would be an example of an American, but they don't have all of the characteristics of an American. Somebody else will have different characteristics that are still American. And if we say Mayan, we're talking about people over thousands of years, right? So are we today the same kind of Americans that we were in Abraham Lincoln's day or in George Washington's day? I mean, they're useful terms early on to kind of get this general idea. Yes, they did practice something similar. They did have similar beliefs. They did have similar practices. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, they're as diverse as we are today.
Well, to me, they're brilliant, and I had I was blessed to be able to go spend the spring equinox, March 2012, in Chichen Itza, spring break for Cancun, or spring break in Cancun, and then Chichen Itza is like a 2.5-hour bus ride, and it's just, oh gosh, between the geometry or the mathematics of the pyramidal inches, and just, gee, it's like, how did they build these pyramids? And I mean, yes, they didn't have like cell phones or internet or any distractions or anything, so it's so beautiful to sit there like by day to like discover everything to do with the sites, and then at night the sound and light show, and under the stars and everything. So to me, everything is just like so perfect. It's like, I mean, like the El Castillo pyramid in Chichen Itza, how they figured out to build this, and the 7 isosceles triangles that form only at this, like at 4:45 in the afternoon is when they're like perfect. It's just amazing, and just everything.
So some of the astronomy that they're building into El Castillo, or the Temple of Kukulkan, is the kind of knowledge that was recognized very early in Maya civilization. So some of the very first architecture that we have anywhere in the formative or the pre-classic period, going back to 600, even 800 BC,